Hello and welcome to the part 3 and lesson 2 of our bookstore application, which we are building to illustrate the use of Spring Framework with Hibernate to build a web-based application. In the previous sections, we saw the introduction on the lesson plan. Then in the lesson 1, we saw the architectural view of the application, and then we saw the folder view of the application. In this lesson, we are going to cover the following items. We will be creating a dynamic web project using Eclipse, which will be used to illustrate the Spring and Hibernate usage to create a web application. Then we'll be adding the required libraries that are needed. Then we'll be creating a simple welcome page, and then we will be adding a domain object or a model object that maps the database tables to the Java object. Time permits, we'll be looking at a DAO, a data access object creation, and testing the data access object right here. So I'm going to switch over to Eclipse. Before I switch, these are all the different libraries we will be adding to the project, which we will be covering what each one of those means as we start using them. Go to File, New, Dynamic Web Project, call it Bookstore, and click on Finish. We now have a project created. We're going to go ahead and add a index.jsp to this project, so the welcome page will show up when you run the application. So I'm going to click on Finish. It creates a index.jsp. Welcome to Bookstore. I will make it bigger. Go ahead and run this application. There you have it. You have the bookstore application created. Now I'm going to go ahead and add the libraries that we will be using for this project. I'm going to go to project properties and then click on add library, and then go to user library. What I've done in my Eclipse IDE or environment is to create a bunch of user libraries that I can plug into multiple projects. The libraries that we'll be using for this project is Spring 3.1, Spring Security 3.1, and then we have Hibernate 4.2. We'll be using the Java JSP standard tag library 1.2.1, and then I have some support libraries, that is custom libraries that are part of the project, adding them, and then the commons. I will also go ahead and add these to the deployment assembly. I'm going to go ahead and click on add and go to Java build path entries and select all these libraries, add them to the deployment assembly, and click on OK. So now we have our Java resources, and we have all the libraries that are added. Let's take a quick look at the libraries here. The Spring 3.1 is the core Spring Framework libraries, which also has the Spring Web component, Spring Web Servlet, which we'll be using for the MVC part of it. Then we have the Hibernate libraries. These are the core Hibernate libraries, required Hibernate libraries. As you can see in the path, it goes to Hibernate required over here. I also have the Hibernate Entity Manager, which is the Hibernate implementation of the JPA persistence API. So that's That's an optional one, but that is part of the JPA package inside Hibernate, and I've added that to the Hibernate user library. This is the JSTL, the Java JSP standard tag library, and the Hibernate's Spring support libraries. We have the aspect oriented programming jar, then the Hibernate validator and the validation API. This is the JavaX API, JavaX validation API, and then this is the Hibernate implementation of the JavaX validation API. And this library here is the simple logging facade for Java, which allows us to plug in different implementation of the logging API into the web application. So you can replace one logging API with another, or logging implementation with another, without having to change the code. So those are all the libraries. And going back to our lesson plan, we created index.jsp, we added the required library, we created a dynamic project. Now we'll go ahead and add a domain object. Go to source, click on new, class. I'm going to call it book and give it a package which is bookstore.domain. Click on finish. We have our book class. We'll be defining some attributes for this class. Let's call private int book ID, which will be our primary key. Then we'll have private string title. Then we'll have private double price. Now that we have defined the attributes, we will need to generate some getters and setters. So I'm going to click on right click and go to source, generate getters and setters, and select these three attributes and click on OK. The getters and setters are generated. I will move the price to the top so they are all next to each other, the attributes. Now we have the domain object defined. We need to add the mapping of this domain object to a database table. So I'm going to use the annotations here. Add entity name equals book. So that will be the database table to which this entity or Java object will map. I need to import it's not showing up in the lookup. I'll try to use the import statements here, or maybe I'll try to refresh the project here and see those libraries get reflected. Sometimes I have trouble with Eclipse refreshing the libraries that I add. So now it's starting to show up, so I'm going to add the entity class from javax.persistence.entity. I'll make the book ID as a primary key, and this is the annotation you use to make an attribute as a primary key. And I will be importing javax.persistence.id. Oops. I'll also make it a generated value. So that is all is needed, or at least at the minimum, for a Java class to be mapped to a database table using the JavaX or JPA annotations. Just to quickly review, we have a entity entity that says that this class is mapped to a table book on the database, and this identifies this particular field as the primary key of the ID value. And then you have the generated value, which says this value will be auto generated. And these two fields will be when we use the annotation based mapping, will automatically the Hibernate will automatically create these two attributes as columns in the resulting table book. Now quickly going back to so that is the domain or model object creation. Going back to our lesson plan, here we have the adding a DAO and DAO IMPL as the next step. So to add a DAO, we go to source, new class. I'm going to call it base DAO and put it in a package called bookstore.dao. I'm going to define two methods here for now. One to create a book and one to list all the books that are part of the table. So let's call it public void persist object obj. And then we are going to call it, this actually shows up as a class. This will be a interface that will be implemented by the base DO IMPL. There is one more method here which uses the Java parameterized type definitions, which will be public list of the type get all another class the same type as the argument. I will need to import the java.util.list, and these are the only two methods we are going to be implementing in our example. So we'll be going back here, create a new Java class, call it base DAO IMPL, which is part of the same package, and I am going to implement this interface. And click on finish. So now we have created the domain or model object, or I should say class, and mapped it to the database, and then we have created the DAO and DAO IMPL. The DAO IMPL is not yet complete. We have to add some annotations and tags and the code to actually persist the entities to the database and also get all the entities. We'll go ahead and quickly add that here. I'm going to define a private entity manager EM, which is part of the JavaX persistence package. I'll also annotate this with the persistence context. We'll use the entity manager, which is the Hibernate implementation of the JavaX persistence entity manager to store and retrieve objects from the database. So I'll do em dot persist of obj. That is pretty much all you need to implement the persistence method. To implement the get all method, we will need to add a typed query and call the typed query to get all the objects of all the database records as objects from the table. So I'm going to use typed query of t query equals em dot create. I'll be picking this particular class here or method, and the first argument is a string, which is a query string from class dot get name. The second argument will be the actual class. It's complaining because I need to import the typed query object javax persistence, and I will be returning a list of query dot get result list. So far we have added the DAO interface and the IMPL, which will use the persistence context injected entity manager to persist an object and get the result. We will be so we covered the creating dynamic web project, adding the required libraries, creating the index.jsp, adding a domain or model class and mapping it to the database table, and adding a DAO and DAO IMPL. In the next section, we will be looking at adding the required configuration files to be able to run this and create a database table and list the results. I'll quickly run this right now to illustrate that this is right now this project can be compiled and run, except it will not be doing any database transactions or queries because we have not plugged in the required persistence code for the entity manager here to be instantiated and allow this particular IMPL class to query the database. So thank you for watching this tutorial. We'll be continuing the Hibernate Spring application implementation in the next session. Looking forward to seeing you soon.